Autumn 1916. A deadly new German fighter, the Albatros. One of its pilots was Manfred von Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron. The Allies countered with the light, fast-climbing Sopwith Pup, underpowered but superbly agile. A year later, the Fokker triplane and the Red Baron's flying circus terrorized the Allies. It was the golden age of the World War I fighter. The planes on the ground are British Sopwith 1.5 strutters. Coming into land is an FE-2. It's autumn 1916. This film shows women of the WRAF, the Women's Royal Air Force, building 1.5 strutters. The WRAF made an enormous contribution to the British war effort. Women were particularly effective in speeding up the slow pace of British aircraft production. Strutters began to arrive on the Western Front in late May 1916, just before the Battle of the Somme. They were British two-seat fighter reconnaissance aircraft, the first used by the Royal Flying Corps to have a synchronized machine gun firing through the propeller arc. An additional Lewis gun operated by the Observer made it a formidable opponent. It was slow into production. By the time it entered service with the RFC in mid-1916, much of its potential advantage was lost. It was more heavily armed than most two-seaters. Here, the Lewis gun is being fitted to a scarf ring, a device that allowed the Observer to aim the gun freely in almost any direction. Lewis gun ammunition came in drums. When a drum was emptied, it was removed and another one clipped on. The 1.5 strutters could dogfight, escort bombers, perform reconnaissance. They were the forerunners of today's multi-role fighters like the F-16. Here, the pilot is furiously pumping fuel to start the engine. The relationship between pilot and observer was crucial. Compatible partners tended to stay together. Their bond could become so strong, the Germans referred to it as a flyer's marriage. For a while, strutters performed well, but they were soon obsolete. On August the 28th, 1916, Chief of the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, resigned, having failed to force victories at Verdun and the Somme. His replacement, Field Marshal Hindenburg with Quartermaster General Erich von Ludendorff, set about revolutionizing Germany's use of air power. Pursuit squadrons, called Jastas, were established. Jasta leaders, like the great Oswald Boelcke, were instructed to switch their tactics from defense to attack. Boelcke trained new pilots in his own theories of aerial combat. Secure every advantage, fire only at close range, fight as a team, always carry an attack through. Among Boelcke's young protégés, one stood out. Manfred von Richthofen. drank in everything Boelcke had to say. He learned fast and achieved immediate success. Hindenburg and Ludendorff also ordered an increase in Germany's aircraft production. The Albatros Company had a new fighter design on the drawing board. Wood was a major component in its construction. Germany needed a fighter to compete with Allied Nieuports and DH-2s. In the absence of a better idea, it ordered that the French Nieuport be copied. But Albatros's own concept was far better. It would re-establish aerial superiority for Germany, not seen since the months of the Fokker scourge. The unique feature of Albatros fighters was the construction of the fuselage. The framework used conventional formers and stringers, but the skin was sheet plywood. At a time when almost all aircraft were covered with stretched fabric, this was very unusual. The plywood, bent into curves around the framework, gave the fuselage great strength and rigidity. The first model was called the D1. It became available in August 1916 and impressed the German authorities. It reached the front in late summer. Feedback to the factory was good. Oswald Boelcke shot down 11 Allied planes in 16 days. On September the 17th, Boelcke led his Jasta of Albatros D1s in the first large formation of German fighter aircraft ever to cross into Allied territory. German air power was at last on the offensive. The new Albatros fighters and their elite young pilots completely outclassed the obsolete British Pusher designs. There was one criticism of the D1. The pilot didn't have a clear view to the front and above. The upper wing was brought closer to the fuselage to solve this problem. The modified version was called the D2. The Albatros had two machine guns fixed in front of the pilot, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. This two-gun pattern would set the standard for both German and Allied fighter aircraft. By the end of 1916, Albatros fighters were being produced at a rate which gave Germany numerical as well as technical fighter superiority. Manfred von Richthofen's father was an Army Reserve major. Manfred continued his family's strong military tradition. A month after receiving his Albatros, his score was 6 Allied aircraft. Von Richthofen and his colleagues in other Jastas honed their fighting skills. German records for September and October 1916 show 211 Allied aircraft destroyed, compared with a German loss of 39. This is rare film of an Albatros attacking a Caudron biplane. There was little doubt about the outcome of such an unequal contest. The lumbering Caudron must be destroyed, unless fate or an Allied fighter intervened. German morale in the air, severely damaged by reversals at Verdun and the Somme, recovered quickly. By October, the Allies had lost their air superiority. A new generation of German fighter pilots, headed by von Richthofen, was making the most of a license to be aggressive. But on October the 28th, a grey autumn day, Boelcke was scheduled to fly an infantry support mission. Dodging an enemy fighter, he brushed his wingtip against his friend Erwin Böhmer's plane. His Albatross crashed to the ground. Bölker, the great pilot and tactician, was dead at 25, with 40 victories. Jasta too was renamed Jasta Bölker in his honor. Germany had lost its greatest aerial hero, but another was preparing to take his place. By early November 1916, von Richthofen had 8 victories. On a patrol above Lagnicourt, in northern France, he was attacked by a British DH-2. In the longest dogfight of the war, von Richthofen claimed his 9th victim. It was Britain's hero, Victoria Cross winner Major Leno Hawker. Von Richthofen had delivered another major blow to Allied morale. In January 1917, von Richthofen was given command of his own squadron, Jasta 11. It had been in existence for several months, but had only scored one unconfirmed victory. Von Richthofen set out to pass on the knowledge and experience he'd learned from Bölker. He coached his pilots personally, analyzing their performance and suggesting improvements. At about this time, a new British fighter was arriving on the Western Front. The Sopwith Pup faced a grave task. Albatrosses were overwhelming every Allied aircraft except the French Spad. The Pup's Larone rotary developed only half the Albatross's 160 horsepower. But what it lacked in power, it made up for in delightful flying qualities. In a dogfight, it could hold its height better than any aircraft of the period, Allied or German. It had a single Vickers machine gun firing through the propeller arc. But production was slow. Germany was able to maintain numerical superiority. In January 1917, Germany introduced a new Albatross, the D3. This is a D3 tail assembly, framed in wood with a fabric covering. The D3's appearance was similar to the earlier models. The fuselage was almost identical. The strong ply covering and sleek shape were retained. The engine was a high-compression model of the 160 horsepower Mercedes. Wing layout was changed to improve downward visibility. The lower wing was made smaller, with V-shaped wing struts like the French Nieuports. V-struts had given Nieuport problems, and they'd do the same for Albatross. They allowed the lower wing to twist dangerously. One of the first D3s was supplied to Manfred von Richthofen. His lower wing cracked in flight. Von Richthofen had his Albatross fuselage painted red, identifying himself to friends and challenging enemies. Von Richthofen would become known to the Allies as the Red Devil. In March 1917, Germany retreated to the heavily fortified Siegfried Line. German aircraft fought to control the air, protecting troops as they moved back. The retreating Germans destroyed anything that could be useful to the advancing Allies. Von Richthofen and his colleagues took their task as a personal challenge. They vowed not to relinquish the air to the Englishmen. From early April, Jasta 11 was based near Douai. On April the 2nd, von Richthofen's orderly awoke him, announcing that the English had arrived. Von Richthofen took off and claimed his first victim of the month that became known to the British flyers as Bloody April. Two weeks later, he'd increased his score to 45. By the end of April, 150 British planes had been destroyed. German newspapers ran stories of a British squadron dedicated to killing von Richthofen. In order to reduce their leader's visibility, his pilots painted their own albatrosses bright red, but Manfred's was still the only completely red machine. All the rest had at least a splash of some other color. In spite of the growing von Richthofen legend, all romance and chivalry had long disappeared from the war. As one British pilot said,
"More often, there was just the sheer bloody murder of the headhunter."
Many British two-seaters in service were obsolete, little more than flying death traps for their crews. Jasta 11 spent the last days of April based at Roucourt, southeast of Douai. In the village, there's a chateau, which von Richthofen used as squadron headquarters. By the end of April, his score had passed 50. On May the 1st, he went on furlough. He left Jasta 11 in the hands of his brother Lothar, who was following in Manfred's footsteps as a deadly fighter pilot. Bloody April was over. Germany had reinforced its superiority in the air. April 1917 had another significance. America entered the war. But American air power was non-existent, and it would take many months and many dollars to have an impact. In spite of the defeats of Bloody April, the spirit of the British Royal Flying Corps remained strong. A new fighter helped. SE-5s from the Royal Aircraft Factory began arriving at the front in the last week of Bloody April. The SE-5 was a stable, tough single-seater with a powerful Hispano-Suiza engine. It had a synchronized Vickers machine gun firing through the propeller arc and a Lewis gun fixed to the upper wing. In the air, it proved to be superior to the Albatros. The SE-5's stationary engine and marked dihedral gave it stability. Great strength allowed it to dive very fast without breaking up. But British ace Albert Ball converted to the SE-5 reluctantly. He preferred his old Newport 17. On May the 7th, Ball took off in a new SE-5. His patrol would encounter von Richthofen's Jasta 11. Manfred was still on furlough, and Lothar was in command. In a confused struggle, Lothar was forced to crash land. Ball's engine was apparently damaged, but no one is really sure why he crashed. His SE-5 hit the ground, and he was killed. Lothar von Richthofen claimed the victory. Ball's death was a major blow to the RFC. But another new star was on the rise. Canadian Billy Bishop fought his first air combat in March 1917. His score mounted rapidly. Only 6 weeks later, he was promoted to captain. By early May, he had 20 victories, flying a Nieuport. His squadron was re-equipped with SE-5s. Bishop finished the war with 72 victories, but recently his claims have been challenged. In the meantime, a curious little British fighter made its debut in battle. It was the Sopwith triplane. Its stack of 3 wings was designed to reduce wingspan and increase wing area, making it handle and climb better than biplanes. It flew with the Royal Naval Air Service and did its job well, but its main legacy was to inspire a famous German copy, the Fokker DR-1. When Manfred von Richthofen returned to the front in June 1917, he had orders to implement a new German air strategy. The Jasters were to be combined into larger battle groups and housed in tents and portable sheds so they could be moved quickly to critical locations. JG-1, von Richthofen's group, was made up of 4 Jasters and their 50 aircraft. A new Albatros fighter, the D-5, was introduced. Its wooden fuselage had an oval cross-section. The top wing was very close to the cockpit. The tremendous success of the first 3 models convinced the Albatros factory to continue the line. They were confident they had a winning formula. The wings and tail of the D-5 were identical to the D-3. The V-strut layout was retained, in spite of its problems under stress. There was a series of fatal crashes as soon as the D-5 entered service. They were caused by wing failure. Extra wire bracing and small struts were added for strength. Pilots were warned not to dive too steeply. Further strengthening was ordered. Aircraft already delivered were to be modified. But inspections showed that this work was not performed. The crashes continued. By then it was clear that new Allied fighters could match the Albatros, and the D-5 offered little advance over its predecessors. But Germany had no real alternatives ready for service. The Albatros D-5 and 5A continued in production. Germany planned a diversion that would help its new fighter groups get established. On June the 13th, 14 long-range Gotha bombers were prepared for takeoff. Their target was London. The raid was successful. 162 Londoners were killed. Britain was outraged. The Royal Flying Corps began withdrawing fighter squadrons from France to protect Britain. Ironically, the efficiency of the Gothas may have been improved by a mistake involving Britain's own long-range giant. On February the 2nd, 1917, a brand new Handley Page bomber went off course and landed unintentionally behind German lines. The Germans were able to examine this latest British strategic weapon in detail before it had even entered service. The Handley Page had a wingspan of 100 feet. It could carry almost 1,800 pounds of bombs, a far cry from the finned artillery shells dropped over the side by hand. The war in the air was approaching its 3rd birthday. To the young men who'd survived that long, it seemed like many lifetimes. It was a strange existence. Conditions on the ground were relatively comfortable, miles behind the trenches. And there was plenty of leisure. Often the weather prohibited flying for days at a time. The spirit that developed in the air services was one of easygoing, casual irreverence. Dress codes were informal. Status was a question of achievement and experience, rather than a badge of rank. New arrivals to this elite brotherhood found that acceptance wasn't automatic. It took time and performance. Casualty rates were high. There was a constant stream of new arrivals to replace those who were killed or transferred. Squadrons developed identities and styles that remained constant in spite of changing personnel. Compared with other services, a high degree of individualism was tolerated. Some of the most extreme and talented pilots were eccentric and difficult to get on with. Squadron life, with its facade of fight hard and play hard, was never without tension, and death was always present. Most pilots coped with this by living as fully as they could in each moment they survived. Squadron identity was proudly cultivated. The French were famous for their escadrille insignia. There was flair, not only in the choice of symbol, but in the elegant execution of the graphics. Some pilots took individualism to the extreme. The French ace Charles Nungesser, repeatedly wounded and injured, was officially ordered to rest. He agreed only on the condition that he was given a roving commission to fly whenever he felt fit. Pilots could achieve almost godlike status. When France's beloved leading ace Georges Guynemer disappeared without trace in September 1917, the French population refused to believe he was dead. René Fonck would become the highest scoring Allied ace, but he never found a place in the heart of France as Guynemer had. There was no doubt about his skill as a pilot. He made sure of that. He became known as a braggart and a bore. And there was no denying his marksmanship. He was famous for extreme economy in his use of ammunition. He took no unnecessary risks and studied the tactics of his opponents carefully. Through 1917, his rate of kills accelerated. Eventually, he succeeded in overtaking Guynemer's score, but never supplanted him as France's most beloved ace. At this decoration ceremony, the pilot in black is Captain Alfred Ertaux, who'd just been shot down and was recovering from severe wounds. René Fonck is on the right. During the war, he received a total of 26 decorations. He destroyed 75 enemy aircraft. In August 1917, a new German fighter appeared on the front. It was the Fokker DR-1. DR stood for the German word Dreidecker, meaning triplane. Its design owed a great deal to the Sopwith triplane. Tony Fokker never hesitated to take other people's ideas and apply his own genius to reinventing them. When the DR-1 appeared, it was scoffed at by the German army authorities at the front. They were strong supporters of the Albatros. But in the hands of the ace Werner Voss, the agile little fighter quickly changed their minds. This is a replica of the DR-1 painted in Werner Voss's colors. The most distinctive feature of the Voss paint scheme was the face pattern around the engine cowling. In 21 days, Voss shot down 22 British aircraft. The DR-1 was small, light, and used a rotary engine. This combination made it an excellent dogfighter. Tony Fokker was happy to concede that he wasn't fast.
I sacrificed speed for climb and maneuverability. The Allies never had an opportunity to realize how slow the triplane was because of the way it climbed, flipped, and stunted in a fight.
But Fokker was not the triplane's designer. Like all the later Fokker fighters, it was the work of Reinhold Platz, something Fokker was careful not to advertise. Manfred von Richthofen was shot down in July, wounded in the head. This film of von Richthofen and the Kaiser was shot in August 1917. Von Richthofen still has a bandage under his cap. The wound was serious, and he was forbidden to fly. He disobeyed, but experienced giddiness and nausea. He took delivery of his DR-1 on September the 1st. On that day, von Richthofen's score stood at 59 kills. His closest German rival was Werner Voss, with 38. On his first mission in the Fokker, von Richthofen had his easiest and one of his strangest victories. He attacked a lone British RE-8. He approached to within 100 yards, and the crew didn't react. The observer simply stood, leaving his guns untouched. Von Richthofen fired 20 bullets and the RE-8 went down. Von Richthofen was sure his DR-1 had been mistaken for a British Sopwith triplane. Unlike the Albatros, the DR-1 had a rotary engine. Germany's major rotary was the Oberursel, a copy of the French Le Rhône. As the war went on, Germany found it harder and harder to find adequate engine supplies. Some DR-1s were fitted with actual Le Rhônes, removed from crashed Allied aircraft. On September the 3rd, von Richthofen prepared for another patrol in his DR-1. This time, his opponent would be a real fighter. The Fokker triplane would meet a British Sopwith Pup in single combat. Von Richthofen and 5 of his Jasta 11 pilots met a patrol of Sopwith Pups. By 1917, patrols at altitudes over 16,000 feet were common. Extreme cold and lack of oxygen caused hypothermia and hypoxia. Both could result in mental confusion and blackouts. Noise from unmuffled engines was constant and intense. Von Richthofen singled out a pup flown by Lieutenant R.F. Bird. The pup and the triplane were well matched. Both were light and highly maneuverable. Both were rotary powered. By 1917, any novelty associated with flying military aircraft had long since disappeared. It was a difficult, taxing job, making extreme physical and mental demands on the pilot. Not only was the possibility of death or horrific injury constant, there were also many physical hardships. Planes could not be set for steady flight. In rotaries, pilots were continually fighting the twisting effect of the spinning engine. After 2 hours in the air, they were often so exhausted they could hardly climb out of the cockpit. Von Richthofen forced Byrd down to lower and lower altitudes. Byrd used up his ammunition firing at troops on the ground. In a forced landing, he deliberately crashed into a tree, so the Germans couldn't take his pup intact. Von Richthofen had scored his 61st victory. This is film taken after that battle. Von Richthofen in the cap and Tony Fokker in the flying helmet are kneeling down to examine bullet holes in the pup's engine cowling. Lieutenant Byrd, now a prisoner of war, is there as well, on the left. 4 days later, von Richthofen returned to convalescent leave. In October, 2 Fokker triplanes broke up in the air. For the time being, the DR-1 was withdrawn from the war. Its reputation never recovered. On September the 23rd, Werner Voss had 48 victories and a massive hangover from celebrating in Berlin. On that day, in one of the epic combats of the war, he was shot down by the RFC's Rhys Davids in an SE-5A. Von Richthofen had lost his Challenger. He concentrated on recovering his health. He relaxed by hunting. In the summer of 1917, a new British fighter entered service. It was the Bristol F-2B, a tough, rugged two-seater that would become one of the best all-round fighters of the war. It was well armed, with a forward-firing Vickers machine gun and a Lewis gun in the observer's cockpit. It was reasonably fast and highly maneuverable. It could be used like a single-seater, with the advantage of an observer to cover the tail. This film was taken far away from the Western Front, in Palestine. Aircraft served on all battlefronts: Russia, Austria, Italy, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Britain destroyed Turkish forces with strafing attacks. Reconnaissance and bombing were the major functions of aircraft away from the Western Front. They battled the enemy and the physical conditions. Heat, dust, sand, and disease were constant problems. Airfields were few. Maintenance for aircraft like these Avro 504s was difficult. Fuel supplies were hard to maintain. But right throughout the war, from 1914 to the armistice, aircraft continued to operate and provide service in the most remote and difficult locations. One of the most famous fighters of the Great War was the Sopwith Camel, introduced in the summer of 1917. This one is trailing castor oil fumes as it takes off. The Camel was fiery and temperamental, extremely difficult to learn to fly. It tricked many student pilots into stalling after takeoff and spinning to their deaths. But in the right hands, it was the most formidable of fighters. It destroyed almost 1,300 enemy aircraft, more kills than any other type in the war. Initially, supplies of Camels to the front were slow, but by the armistice, more than 4,000 had seen service. They used several varieties of rotary engine. Horsepower could vary from 100 to 150. Pilots either loved or hated the Camel. No one who flew it could afford to take it lightly. The fuselage was a wooden box girder, braced with wires and covered with fabric. There were plywood panels below the cockpit and aluminium panels behind the engine cowling. The name Camel came from the hump in front of the pilot, housing two Vickers machine guns. A pilot who knew the Camel's ways could outmaneuver any other fighter of the time. Because of the effect of its rotary engine, the nose would drop in a right turn and do the opposite, going left. An uncoordinated tight turn was likely to lead to a fatal spin. But these eccentricities could be harnessed to perform sudden and rapid movements that could win a dogfight. By early 1918, the Sopwith Camel was the most feared of all the Allied single-seat fighters. On the morning of April the 21st, 1918, Captain Roy Brown, a Canadian serving with Royal Flying Corps No. 209 Squadron, waited for the mist to clear. He was to lead a formation of Sopwith Camels in the Somme area east of Amiens. It was due to leave at 8:15 a.m., but was delayed for more than an hour. A new pilot had joined Brown's unit, an old school friend, Wilfrid May, known as Wop. At 9:35 a.m., Brown's squadron took off to patrol at 12,000 feet along the Somme Valley. A few miles across the front, Manfred von Richthofen, with a select group of his Jasta 11 pilots, took off for the same area. Von Richthofen, whose score was now 80 victories, was due to go on leave in 2 days' time. The two units met. Von Richthofen targeted Brown's friend, Wop May. Brown dived to help and took a position behind von Richthofen. According to Brown, von Richthofen apparently didn't see him. One of the cardinal rules of the fighter pilot was to check 6. 6 is 6 o'clock, the point on an imaginary clock face directly behind the tail. Von Richthofen had still not recovered fully from his head wound.
I am in wretched spirits after every aerial battle. The war is very serious, very grim.
Brown fired. A full burst ripped the side of the Fokker. According to Brown, the pilot looked back. Then he collapsed in his seat. But at the same time, Australian troops on the ground were firing at the red triplane. It came in for a rough landing near a brickworks on Morlancourt Ridge, above the Somme Valley. Damage was slight, but the pilot was dead. Nobody's sure whether Brown or Australian ground fire killed von Richthofen. As soon as the body was identified, a rush for souvenirs began. The red triplane was literally ripped to pieces. The fabric was torn off and bullet hole evidence destroyed. Von Richthofen's funeral took place near the village of Bertangle, north of Amiens. The Allies buried him with full honors. After the bitterness of the war, it was an extraordinary mark of respect. The honor guard was a group of 13 Australian soldiers with their rifles reversed. It was 11 days before von Richthofen's 26th birthday. When the war ended, his record of 80 victories had not been equaled. On the left is Hermann Göring. On the right is Bruno Lörzer. They were both successful pilots and had been friends for some time when von Richthofen was killed. In July, Göring, pompous and selfish, was given command of von Richthofen's fighter group. The flying circus would never be the same.
A young aviator lay dying at the start of a bright summer's day. To the mechanics assembled around him, these few parting words he did say. Take the cylinder out of my kidneys, the connecting rod out of my brain. From the small of my back take the crankshaft and assemble the engine again.